There have been numerous rivalries throughout the history of rock and roll, but perhaps one of the strangest and most questionable among them is the beef between grunge pioneers Nirvana and Pearl Jam in the early 90s. Much of grunge's explosion could be accredited to both Nirvana and Pearl Jam, who both released classical albums in 1991, Nirvana's Nevermind and Pearl Jam's 10. And because both bands led the grunge revolution, it was speculated among the media and eventually fans that the two had a rivalry. Press interviews and stories from both sides seemingly allude to a feud between both bands. But was there really? Stay tuned as we break down the supposed rivalry between Nirvana and Pearl Jam, from the stories of band members to interviews with the press, and investigate if there really was beef between them to begin with. Seattle births Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Nirvana and Pearl Jam weren't just two of the most influential bands in the early 90s. They also came from the same tight-knit musical community in Seattle. So the idea of a feud brewing between the two bands was odd on paper. In the 80s, the Los Angeles-based hair metal bands ruled the airwaves and set the standards for rock and roll. But miles away, a new musical movement began taking root in Seattle by the late 80s. It eschewed the excessiveness of hair metal and embraced a free-spirited, do-it-yourself punk attitude, both in its visual presentation and music. The new genre that sprang from the scene would later be called grunge and was used to label many bands that emerged from Seattle during that time. Two of those bands were Nirvana and Pearl Jam. Nirvana was a project initiated by Kurt Cobain and Chris Novoselic. After going through several drummers, they were joined by Chad Channing, who performed with them on their debut album, Bleach. Released in 1989, Bleach became popular in college radio stations and the Seattle scene, and was well received by critics. A year after Bleach came out, a new band from the ashes of the Seattle-based band Mother Love Bone, which had just ended after the sudden death of their vocalist, Andrew Wood. Two members of Mother Love Bone, Stone Gossard and Jeff Ament, recruited guitarist Mike McCready, drummer Dave Cruzan, and San Diego-based singer Eddie Vedder into their new band. Initially, they went by the name Mookie Blaylock after the NBA player of the same name. Eventually, they were signed to Epic Records and changed their name to Pearl Jam. Nirvana and Pearl Jam become superstars. On August 27, 1991, Pearl Jam released their debut album, 10. It would later be regarded as one of grunge's defining releases and one of rock's all-time best debuts. But it didn't catch on with the mainstream immediately and sold slowly in its first few months. A month later, on September 24th, Nirvana released their second album, Nevermind. Recognized as the album that catapulted Nirvana and the entire grunge scene into mainstream prominence, Nevermind was an unexpectedly massive success. In just a few weeks, Nirvana became the biggest rock band in the world. Their popularity went beyond music. The trio basically shaped the culture of the early 90s to be more in line with the aesthetic and mentality of the grunge scene. And frontman Kurt Cobain suddenly found himself becoming the spokesperson for Generation X. The success of Nevermind helped bring attention to Nirvana's grunge peers, including Pearl Jam. 10 started climbing up the Billboard 200, eventually breaking into the top 9 months after its initial release. It later peaked at the number 2 spot. By early 1993, 10 was outselling Nevermind in the US. Nirvana and Pearl Jam were the top 2 bands of the grunge movement, and a competitive rivalry akin to the Beatles versus the Rolling Stones seemed to be taking shape. Much like the Beatles and the Stones, Nirvana and Pearl Jam were sonically different despite both falling under the grunge umbrella. Nirvana were raw, subversive, and leaned more on the punk side of things, while Pearl Jam embraced classic rock and wrote songs that were made for arenas. Initially, it was a matter of which style proved more popular. However, comments made by Kurt Cobain in the music press alluded to something more personal going on between both bands. Kurt Cobain targets Pearl Jam. In the Kurt Cobain biography, Heavier Than Heaven, author Charles R. Cross mentions that rumors about a Nirvana versus Pearl Jam feud emerged from interpretations of Kurt's interviews, where he stated that he wasn't a fan of Eddie Vedder's band. At the time, Kurt was getting asked a lot about his substance issues. Not wanting to discuss the issue, Kurt instead redirected the discussion to bands he didn't like, and Pearl Jam came up as one of the bands he mentioned. And since Pearl Jam was one of the biggest bands in the world at the time, with some even considering them as big as Nirvana, Kurt's comments attracted a lot of attention from fans and the press who clung to them and started making stories. In an interview, Kurt expressed his disdain for bands who in his eyes came from the same mold as the 80s hair bands, despite not wearing spandex and sounding nothing like them. Perhaps Kurt was referring to their musical style, which just like the hair bands was made for big arenas and was too mainstream for his taste. Kurt accused these bands of riding on the coattails of the alternative scene when it boomed, and the most prominent band that he included in his blacklist was Perl Jam. Those bands have been in the hairspray cock rock scene for years, and all of a sudden they stop washing their hair and start wearing flannel shirts. It doesn't make any sense to me, Kurt said. In other words, Perl Jam was not truly grunge and simply adopted its aesthetic to gain popularity. And Kurt, being the extremely passionate epitome of non-90s nonconformity, didn't want to be associated with such corporate bands. Rolling Stone mentioned this interview in an article about the Nirvana-Pearl Jam feud in 1992. The magazine wrote that Kurt particularly disliked Pearl Jam and accused the band of being corporate, alternative, and cock rock fusion. In the same article, Rolling Stone reached out to Pearl Jam's Jeff Ament for his thoughts regarding Kurt's comments. He responded that he didn't know where the hate was coming from and would have appreciated if Kurt discussed his issues with them directly. Heavier Than Heaven also makes mention of a fight that almost broke out between Kurt and Pearl Jam's drummer Dave Abruzzese until Pearl Jam's tour manager broke things up. However, in another interview with MTV, Kurt clarified that he had no personal issue with Vedder or any of the Pearl Jam boys, but he was simply not a fan of their music. He also said that he's had phone conversations with Vedder since, and that he finds him a really nice person. The two were later seen playfully slow dancing at the 1992 MTV Video Music Awards, which seemingly erased any idea that there was personal animosity between the two. In another interview a year later, Kurt maintained his stance regarding Pearl Jam's music, but admitted that he may have gone out of line with his earlier comments, saying that at the time he hadn't met Vedder yet. He added that he should have targeted Pearl Jam's record label instead of the band, as he believes the corporate higher-ups were responsible for marketing Pearl Jam as something they weren't, at least in Kurt's eyes. In the book Serving the Servant by Nirvana's former manager Danny Goldberg, he states that Kurt did like Vedder, but felt a need to compete with Pearl Jam. In 1993, both bands released a new album, Nirvana's In Utero and Pearl Jam's Verses. Kurt felt that Nirvana's album was a more challenging record, while Pearl Jam remained safe with their sophomore effort, and thus Nirvana should have won that round. But the numbers said otherwise, as Verses outsold In Utero that year and managed to set a record by selling almost 1 million copies in its first 5 days. Death of Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder's reaction. In 1994, Nirvana made headlines around the world when news of the death of Kurt Cobain broke out. Vedder recalls that he got so emotional upon hearing of the news that he destroyed everything in sight in his hotel room in Washington, D.C. that day. Around the time of Kurt's death, Pearl Jam minus their drummer Dave Abruzzese was in D.C. to meet with then-President Bill Clinton. According to the band's longtime manager Kelly Curtis, Clinton asked Vedder if he should address the country about Kurt's death. Vedder replied that he shouldn't, as it may inadvertently influence many others to do what Kurt did. A few days after Kurt's death, Pearl Jam performed as the musical guest for an episode of Saturday Night Live. After the performance, Vedder revealed a letter K written over his shirt, a quiet tribute to the fallen Nirvana frontman. Years later, Vedder clarified that contrary to popular belief at the time, there was no bad blood between Nirvana and Pearl Jam, and the feud was simply a story cooked up by the media by taking things that were said from both sides out of context.